Excuse me, I'm wondering, how do free markets work? Great question, Econ Elephant. I note that you're also interested in electronics, and I love that you have a diverse array of interests. Let's talk about free markets, aka Economics 101. So, we're going to look at the supply demand curve to understand how we can use a simple mathematic model to represent buying and selling goods and services. All right, it's actually a lot more fun and interesting than it might seem. And also, it's very relevant, right? Because we use money to buy things. So, how do we think about that? How do these concepts of free markets work? All right, so let's look at a handy dandy plot called the supply and demand curve. This is Econ 101. What we are going to do is we're going to learn about the supply and demand curve, and then we will learn about the assumptions that go into this and the limitations. All right, very important. Anytime we're looking at a mathematical model or a scientific model, we have to understand how it works and also what the limits are and what the assumptions are. So we're going to do that. Yay, here we go. Okay, so we're going to make a handy dandy plot. On the vertical axis, we have price. So since I am in the US, I'm going to use dollars, but this could be euros, it could be pesos, wherever you happen to live, the thing that you use to buy stuff. And on the bottom, the horizontal axis, we have quantity, or the amounts of something. Quantity, and this is going to be just a number. So how much stuff is available for you to buy? Okay, so we have two curves on our two things to model. We have the demand of something. So when we go to the store and we are looking for the things that we want to buy, we are going to be impacted by our decisions are going to be impacted by the price of the item. So eggs are a good example right now, right? Because the price of eggs has gone way up, and so I'm less likely to buy eggs. In other words, when something has a high price, I don't want to buy a lot of it. Okay? If something has a low price, like used books in particular, for me, that's kind of my kryptonite, I'm going to want to buy a lot of them. And so we can model the demand curve like this: high price, I don't want to buy a lot. High price, low quantity. Low price, high quantity. Okay? So this is the demand curve. On the flip side, you have people that are making and selling goods and services. And if they can only sell for a low price, it costs money to make stuff, right? So if they can only sell for a low price, they're not going to want to make a lot of that particular good. But if they can sell for a high price, then they're like, "Oh, let's go. Let's make all the things." But if there's no demand for all of that stuff that they're making, then it just sits idle. So if our supply curve looks like this, and supply curve is how much stuff the manufacturers or the companies sell, then the kind of ideal price is going to be right where these lines cross. This is called the equilibrium. And this is the price, the ideal price in a purely competitive market. That's key assumption number one. That will be the price that the market lands on. And this will be kind of the quantity that the market kind of lands on, right? There'll be a little bit of ebb and flow, but in a purely competitive market, you will end up with prices that are fairly stable and amounts that are fairly stable. We really saw this on display during the pandemic because the demand of certain goods and services changed dramatically. For example, a lot of folks were working from home, so we needed office equipment, we needed video cameras. But the market had landed on a particular quantity and price for those goods. So, in the short term, what happened is that as demand increased for those items, people were willing to pay more for the same amount of things, but the supply hadn't caught up yet. Eventually, what happens is that we got a new demand curve where the new price that people were willing to pay, at least temporarily, was higher. So in this case, we have a higher price, P1, and we also ended up with more quantity. Okay, so if demand goes up, like it did during the pandemic for office equipment, then the price will go up and the quantity will go up. People making these things or reselling them can charge more, and they also are going to want to make more because there's more demand. More folks are working from home. We need more shit. Okay, sorry. I get one. All right. This can also happen with the supply curve. Well, actually, okay, I should step back. What happens if demand decreases? What do you think? If demand goes down, then we have a curve that moves to the left. And in that case, price will go down and the number of companies making these things or the amount that these companies make will also go down. Okay, so now let's look at the supply curve. Let's say there's a technological innovation that allows a particular good, like a computer chip, to be made more easily and more cheaply. Well, in that case, firms have a lower cost of producing, so they're willing to make more for less. So in that case, the supply curve will shift to the right. Boop, 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 boop. And if we're looking at our original demand curve, then we have, oh, here, I should mark this dot. So this is when the demand curve shifts. And this new dot, this red dot, is when the supply curve shifts. Oh, look at that. That's cute. I matched it. Okay, so in this case, the price drops. We'll call this P2 because we already looked at that. And the quantity increases. So if supply goes up, the price goes down and the quantity goes up. That's pretty cool, right? And likewise, if supply drops, then price goes up and quantity goes down. That's really what happened during the pandemic. Okay, so pretty useful model to help us understand all of these different factors that go into pricing. But key assumptions. Okay, we talked about one, purely competitive market, aka no monopolies. If there is a monopoly, this entire thing breaks down because it doesn't matter really what the customer demand is. There's only one producer or one company that can produce that supply or sell that supply. They can set whatever price they want. And as long as there is some demand, then people will have to pay that price. And this is why monopolies are bad, because it causes market failures. The market does not work effectively when there is a monopoly because the consumer demand does not help keep the supply in check. The second big assumption here is based on Adam Smith's concept of the rational human. And what that claims is that people buy and sell goods and services in a way in a way where we make logical decisions based on price and money. As we all know, humans are squishy, and that is not always the case. It's kind of interesting to think about, right? Because even with the demand curve, there's a little bit of a hint that demand can change based on preferences. And what is even a preference? Sometimes we want something and that want is a little squishy. Sometimes we truly need something like food and water. And so if the supply goes down, we're willing to pay for food. We're willing to pay higher prices for food. But sometimes if something is trendy, we're willing to pay higher prices just because. And that is not necessarily a logical decision in all cases. So the assumption that humans are buying and selling goods and services from a rational point of view is a pretty big assumption, in my opinion. There are also some assumptions that effectively, when we are using the supply demand curve, that everything else in the market is constant. We talked about how the supply demand curve changes, right? So if we're looking at a particular curve, we're assuming that income, consumer incomes are not changing, that tech isn't changing, that the number of companies producing goods and services isn't changing, that the cost of producing those goods and services isn't changing. And so that's why you have to kind of think about, a market is never static. So if you're looking at a particular supply demand curve for a product, you have to acknowledge that that is a snapshot point in time. That supply demand curve will change. And also, it's a gross simplification. There are a lot of limitations to this model. It can be a useful model, but there's a lot of limitations and we cannot apply it to everything. And really, we can't apply it to the market as a whole because it does not take externalities into account. An externality is a cost or sometimes a benefit to a third party that is not involved in the transaction. Meaning, let's say there's a town of people where the good is being produced. That company or that manufacturing plant is polluting the environment. That is a negative cost on people that are not necessarily buying the good or service. Yeah, we're using a good in in this example. So um, a benefit might actually, there might be some externality benefits, which would be, this is a cute one I saw, like a beekeeper's bees are pollinating the crops or maybe the flowers of the local neighbors, and that's lovely, right? Um, but negative externalities are really what we need to keep in mind here because those can lead to market failures. If we do not take externalities into account, if we do not have things like regulation to prevent these externalities and to protect the people that are not involved in buying or selling the goods, market failures can happen. One obvious example is with pollution. If a manufacturing plant is polluting the water, then let's say they bring in water to cool their systems, then they pollute the water. Eventually, they pollute the water so much that the heat transfer coefficient of the water changes and it doesn't successfully cool their plant. So a firm is not necessarily going to take those externalities into account because they are most focused on providing the optimum price for the consumer. That's not necessarily a bad thing. It's not their job necessarily to think about externalities. That is the role of government. That is the role of society, is to say, hey, there are things outside of your company that you are impacting, and it is the government's job to put limitations and restrictions on that so that we protect the neighbors, that we protect the ecosystems, and ultimately that we protect the market as a whole so that new companies can come up and produce goods and services and not be negatively impacted by the poor decisions of a previous company, or I should say, the short sighted decisions of a prior company. Um, those are the main limitations. And There are also some, consumer externalities. So, for example, if you were buying something, the impact of you buying something may have positive or negative impacts on other people. Like if you have to go somewhere to purchase something, and then all of a sudden that thing blows up, then now that whole area is really crowded. That might be an example. But it's often supplier externalities that are not taken into account that are really potentially dangerous causes of market failure. And there's lots of examples of those in history. So, okay, again, very simple model, very simple. This is the most basic that you can get. We've stripped out everything except for supply and demand, and we've hyperfixated on price and figuring out like at what price and quantity does the market kind of settle into? Does the free market settle into? But I find it really interesting, right? Because you can take something really complex as millions or billions of people buying and selling a bunch of stuff, and you can kind of piece um, you can kind of strip away some of the layers and just get to some basic fundamental representation of how that buying and selling happens. And you can learn a lot from that, right? Like, I think that it's really interesting when you can say, okay, if demand goes up, then price will probably go up and quantity will also probably go up, which again, we saw during the pandemic with toilet paper, for example. The market evens out. It takes time, but it often evens out. It also helps us to understand what guidelines, what regulations we need to place on the market to make sure that we enable the free market to continue, because it is pretty useful, and also to protect consumers and to protect our wonderful earth so that humans can exist for, as long as we might be able to exist, and taking care of all of the other creatures on this earth. So I really like these types of models because it helps us to understand the big picture. Cool. All right. Well, thanks for hanging out. I hope that you learned some stuff. I think Econ Elephant did too. Please let me know if you have any questions about the supply demand curve. If you would like to continue on, we could do a little Econ 101 series. I have a video on tariffs if you're curious about the impact of tariffs on a particular market. So yeah, if you want to learn about externalities or other concepts in economics, please let me know and we can dig in, because knowledge is power. All right. Thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you next time. Bye.